Your Excellency, Mr. Sergio Duarte, United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Air Commodore Singh, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New Delhi. We take great pride in hosting this international conference on a subject that touches upon the very survival of humankind. 20 years ago, on this very day, our former Prime Minister, Shri Rajiv Gandhi, addressed the third special session on disarmament of the United Nations General Assembly. Speaking on the theme of a world free of nuclear weapons, he introduced an action plan calling on the international community to negotiate a binding agreement on general and complete disarmament. At the heart of the action plan was a commitment to eliminate all nuclear weapons in 3 stages by the year 2010. Rajiv Gandhi believed that disarmament, in particular nuclear disarmament, was essential to usher in a safe and non-violent world. He had a deep insight into the nature of evolution of technology, its potential for advancing human welfare, and also for unleashing destruction. In this context, he was acutely aware of the power of the atom. He wished that it should never again be used for destructive purposes. Rajiv Gandhi's action plan was a comprehensive exposition of India's approach towards global disarmament and continuity in our thinking. It symbolizes, as I said, the continuity in our thinking since 1954, when India pioneered the call for a complete ban on nuclear testing. The essential features of the action plan continue to remain valid even today. A review of developments since 1988 presents a mixed picture on how far the world has moved to realize the vision of Rajiv Gandhi. On the one hand, the end of the Cold War has created an opportunity for the world to move away from the dangerous doctrines that were based on the precept of mutually assured destruction. Greater engagement and realization of the interdependent nature of global security among major powers has created new space for action on disarmament. In 1993, the Conference on Disarmament was able to finalize the Chemical Weapons Convention, a multilateral, non-discriminatory and internationally verifiable treaty aimed at eliminating an entire category of weapons of mass destruction by a fixed date, namely 2012. On the other hand, the painful reality is that the goal of global disarmament, based on the principles of universality, non-discrimination, and effective compliance, still remains a distant dream. Even more disturbing, however, is the emergence of new threats and challenges to global security. I refer to the growing risk that nuclear weapons may be acquired by terrorists or those driven by extreme ideologies, the increasing danger of non-state actors accessing nuclear materials and devices, the development of new weapon systems based on emerging technologies which pose challenges to space security and provide new roles for nuclear weapons, and bilateral arms control, I have slight difficulty in mind, and the weakening of multilateralism even as bilateral arms control processes falter in shifting strategic landscape. The threat of climate change and global warming itself raises a range of security concerns, especially for us in the developing world. India, which has witnessed rapid economic growth in the last few years and aspires for even higher growth rates in the future, needs a peaceful international environment so that we can focus our resources on improving the lives of our people. We seek a world in which power flows through the empowerment of people and from the strength and resilience of our economy, our society, our polity, our institutions, and our values. Our energy needs will continue to rise in the foreseeable future. We do not have the luxury of limiting our options of energy sources. We therefore wish to create an international environment in which nuclear technology is used not for destructive purposes, but for helping us meet our national development goals and our energy security. Ladies and gentlemen, India is fully aware of its responsibilities as a nuclear weapons state. We have a declared doctrine of no first use that is based on credible minimum deterrence. We have in place strict controls on the export of nuclear and fissile-related materials and technologies. India has no intention to engage in an arms race with anyone. Above all, India is fully committed to nuclear disarmament that is global, universal, and non-discriminatory in nature. The pursuit of this goal will enhance not only our security, but the security of all other countries as well. These objectives cannot be achieved through partial methods and approaches. The only effective form of nuclear disarmament and elimination of nuclear weapons is global disarmament. Nuclear weapons know no boundaries. Even today, the nuclear arsenals in possession of the major powers are enough to destroy the world many times over. In this scenario, it is not possible to regionalize nuclear disarmament. It is in keeping with this approach that India has recently submitted a working paper on nuclear disarmament to the United Nations General Assembly, containing initiatives on nuclear disarmament. We hope to stimulate a debate and promote consensus on the way forward. These proposals have also been submitted before the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. They are, I believe, a set of practical measures for working towards the goal of a nuclear weapon-free world. We do not wish to exclude other measures that may contribute to achieving this goal, nor do we hold that there is a rigid hierarchy among these steps and a specific sequencing for their implementation. The measures we suggest include reaffirmation of the unequivocal commitment of all nuclear weapon states to the goal of complete elimination of nuclear weapons, reduction of the salience of nuclear weapons in security doctrines, adoption of measures by nuclear weapon states to reduce nuclear danger, including the risk of accidental use of nuclear weapons, negotiation of a global agreement among nuclear weapon states on the first use of nuclear weapons, negotiation of a universal and legally binding agreement on non-use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states, negotiation of a convention on the complete prohibition of the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons, and negotiation of a nuclear weapons convention prohibiting the development, production, stockpiling, and use of nuclear weapons and on their destruction, leading to the global non-discriminatory and verifiable elimination of nuclear weapons within a specified time frame. Ladies and gentlemen, these proposals retain the spirit and substance of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan. We hope that other states will agree to a dialogue on these proposals and will join us in committing to nuclear disarmament. That is the critical first step, a commitment, preferably a binding legal commitment through an international instrument to eliminate nuclear weapons within a time-bound framework. In parallel with this general commitment to nuclear disarmament, we need strengthening non-proliferation commitment, such as on denying nuclear material, technology and equipment to terrorists. Tending global nuclear disarmament, all states must ensure that they do not allow proliferation of sensitive technologies into dangerous hands. Ladies and gentlemen, India is ready to add its own weight and voice to the global debate on nuclear disarmament with a view to crafting such a consensus on disarmament and non-proliferation. We need a truly collective approach anchored in a universal partnership that is supported by non-governmental communities and public opinions. As such, great importance attaches to the success of your deliberation. I wish your deliberation all success. I thank you.
Your Excellency, Dr. Ashok Kumar, Acting Director. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like first of all to thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Indian Council for World Affairs for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. Though I will speak briefly today as I was asked to, I also asked our hosts to distribute the full text of my prepared remarks. The action plan introduced by India in 1988 does indeed deserve to be remembered, both for its wisdom and for the abiding relevance of the powerful vision of a path towards a safer and more peaceful world. It is not surprising that such a vision would emerge from a land the world has long associated with the non-violent ideals of Buddha and Mahatma Gandhi. In introducing this plan to the General Assembly, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi called nuclear deterrence, and I quote from his words, the ultimate expression of the philosophy of terrorism. A doctrine that, in his words, and I quote again, will take us like lemmings to our own suicide. Yet today, we have about 8 or 9 states that possess nuclear weapons, and some adhere to this doctrine. Over half of the world's population now lives in states that are armed with nuclear weapons or are covered by nuclear umbrellas. Can the action plan, which was reported and soon followed by India's own decision to acquire such weapons, still inspire constructive multilateral initiatives for global nuclear disarmament? I believe it can, especially if viewed in its historical context. The world knows that India has long advocated the elimination of nuclear weapons. I am pleased that the United Nations Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament in Asia and Pacific will open next month in Kathmandu, as the General Assembly has directed us to do. And this is an event that has long been promoted by India. And the Center will both need and welcome the support of India in the years ahead. India's efforts for nuclear disarmament have in fact spanned several decades. Mahatma Gandhi often condemned the atomic bombs in Japan. On April 2, 1954, Prime Minister Nehru issued his famous call for a halt to nuclear tests. In the decade of 1960s, India used its membership in the 18-Nation Disarmament Committee, the ENDC in Geneva, to argue for disarmament and a comprehensive non-proliferation initiative, which covered both the geographic spread of nuclear weapons and their qualitative improvement by possessor states. I witnessed these contributions as a junior member of the Brazilian delegation to that committee. Throughout that decade, India participated in what was known as the Group of 8, a small but diverse group of states in the committee, sharing common views on disarmament issues. This group issued many joint memoranda to elaborate these views, in particular the close relationship between non-proliferation and disarmament. In November 1965, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 2028, which called on the ENDC to negotiate a nuclear non-proliferation treaty that embodied, or would embody, 5 principles. One of these provided that the treaty should embody an acceptable balance of mutual responsibilities and obligations. India continued to argue throughout this period that non-proliferation efforts must be aimed to the goal of disarmament. When the NPT was finally opened for signature in 1968, India objected that the treaty did not satisfy the criteria of Resolution 2028 because of the different obligations of the nuclear weapon and the non-nuclear weapon states. In the late 1970s, especially after India detonated the peaceful nuclear device in 1964, growing international concerns about the threat of nuclear weapons proliferation, expanding nuclear arsenals, and the deterioration of relations between the two superpowers inspired new approaches to revitalize disarmament efforts. These concerns led to the General Assembly's first special session on disarmament in 1978, which adopted an international disarmament strategy covering both goals and the institutions needed to achieve them. Global demands for progress in disarmament continued over the years to come. It led to the establishment of the Palme Commission, with India's Ambassador C.D. Muthama as one of its members. Shortly after its strongly pro-disarmament report was released in June 1982, an estimated 1 million people marched in New York City for global nuclear disarmament. In May 1984, Palme joined with several other world leaders, including India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, to launch the Six Nation Initiative, an idea promoted by a group called Parliamentarians for World Order. And I am pleased to recognize my good friend Senator Douglas Roche of Canada the first international president of this group, who is attending our event today. By the time Rajiv Gandhi launched his action plan in the General Assembly, many of its components had already gained widespread support throughout the world. While the plan emphasized disarmament, it also had several broader objectives that, in his words, constituted ideas for the conduct of international relations in a world free of nuclear weapons. The plan proposed the elimination of nuclear weapons in a three-stage process that was to conclude no later than the year 2010 by means of a nuclear weapons treaty to replace the NPT. All states must be part of the disarmament process, which would also aim at establishing a broader comprehensive global security system involving doctrines, policies, and institutions to sustain a world free of nuclear weapons. The plan identified goals for deep reductions in nuclear arsenals, a cutoff in the production of fissile material for weapons purposes, a test ban, a prohibition on the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons, and the establishment of an integrated multilateral verification system under the aegis of the United Nations. The plan also called for several other initiatives associated with general and complete disarmament and with strengthening compliance with the UN Charter. It is, of course, possible to update various parts of this plan, yet most of its initiatives remain quite relevant today. Let us recall that both the General Assembly and the states parties to the NPT have repeatedly identified specific criteria that must apply to future efforts in the field of nuclear disarmament, criteria that include verification, transparency, irreversibility, and the need to move forward through binding legal commitments. It seems to me that these are precisely the type of criteria that were proposed in 1988 in the Action Plan. And I also find that the plan is fully consistent with the common sense approach adopted for decades in the pursuit of general and complete disarmament, namely that both nuclear disarmament and conventional arms limitation should be pursued simultaneously, just as the goals of disarmament and non-proliferation must also be advanced together rather than sequentially. The 1988 Action Plan, however, did not provide much guidance on specific means that would be needed to achieve its goals, means that will, of course, vary with the different political and technological circumstances among the various states. I personally believe the course ahead will depend heavily upon initiatives from both non-governmental organizations and concerned governments throughout the world. As Rajiv Gandhi stated in his speech to the General Assembly in 1988, and I quote from that speech, "The battle for peace, disarmament, and development must be waged both within this assembly and outside by the peoples of the world." And he added that the ultimate power to bring about change rests with the people. Today, we have the Seven-Nation New Agenda Coalition and the Seven-Nation Norwegian Initiative, which are both working to advance many of the goals also found in the Action Plan. And both are backed by NGOs around the world. In Japan, the Mayors for Peace initiative now consists of 2,277 mayors in 129 countries to advance their own overall action plan for peace and disarmament. In the United States, we have numerous NGOs, and in other countries too, working to advance nuclear disarmament goals in a collective effort that has been revitalized by the publication of opinion editorials by former U.S. officials, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, William Perry, and Sam Nunn, advancing the so-called Hoover Plan for global nuclear disarmament. These are just some of the various plans and initiatives that are very much alive in the pursuit of global nuclear disarmament. They deserve our recognition and our support. As an approach to international peace and security, disarmament has always embodied a fusion of ideals and self-interest. It's not just a dream, but a practical means to achieve security, one that is far more reliable than its alternatives, including nuclear deterrence, the balance of power, or self-help. Much has been written about how nuclear weapons have been pursued for reasons of security and prestige. In the years ahead, I believe much more will have been written about how these same goals have been achieved far better through the elimination of such weapons. Nuclear disarmament unites what is right with what works. And this is why it has become, in the language of this conference, a strategic necessity. As a former pilot, perhaps Rajiv Gandhi had flown over too many countries without witnessing any walls or barbed wire fences. Perhaps he saw the globe as a whole, a place where people of all nationalities share common values, common purposes, and common interests. I believe this was the basic concept that inspired the 1988 Action Plan. It is an idea well worth the name of action, now, 20 years later, in 2008. I'd like to finish these remarks by recalling the distinguished Indian ambassador, Ricky Jaipal, whom I knew as a junior member of the Brazilian delegation in Geneva. He once led the United Nations Disarmament Secretariat, and he has written in one of his books, and I quote from the book, "The danger of nuclear war will remain with us as long as there are people who think that the nuclear weapon cannot be disinvented. They should be aware that the human race cannot be reinvented after a nuclear holocaust." Ricky Jaipal's words are an eloquent reminder that the key to future progress in disarmament remains in the realm of reshaping human perceptions. Perceptions not just of the danger of possessing such weapons, but also the many benefits of eliminating them. These perceptions will together lead us to a world free of nuclear weapons. Let us recommit ourselves today to achieving this great and historic goal. I thank you for your attention.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ambassador Duarte, the Honorable Mani Shankara, Commodore Singh, Excellencies, the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Indian Council for World Affairs, please accept my gratitude for the privilege of addressing you this morning. I want to start off and say how heartened I personally am by the outstanding remarks of the Prime Minister reaffirming India's commitment to a nuclear weapons-free world and emphasize how important his speech was in the hopes that that speech will be broadcast far and wide to the whole world. It's exactly that kind of leadership that is necessary at this historical moment. I would like to honor the powerful words of the sage Swami Vivekananda, who addressed the first Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in 1893 and began saying, "Sisters and brothers of America, please permit me to say with heartfelt enthusiasm, sisters and brothers of India." It might appear that we have come here from great distances, but as never before the world is one neighborhood, and we are all living very close to one another. It's interesting how a suburban American like myself has come to appreciate this truth. Near my home, I buy my petrol from a Russian concession. The bank for my country, acknowledging the reality of current debt and currency resources, is your neighbor, China. When my phone or computer needs service, I consult a technical expert in real time in Bangalore or Mumbai. Our lives are so deeply interconnected, our destinies have become one. What an honor to be in a nation which itself can serve the world as an example of how great diversity can lead to cultural enrichment, democratic participation, and grow united in common purposes. For those who appreciate the mystery of the life of civilization, India represents more than just a great nation. Its name resonates in the heart as a cultural, spiritual treasury for all humanity. The Indus Valley civilization reminds us of Tulsidas, Mahavir, Buddha, Kajamunuddin Chishti, Asoka, Guru Nanak, Baba Muhammadin, Ramakrishna, Mirabai, Mahatma Gandhi, and so many other luminaries. And in this gathering today, the political leadership of Rajiv Gandhi. Every name reminds us of leadership in the practice of our core humanity. And this remembrance raises our vision to a place where nuclear weapons should have no acceptable position. To use nuclear weapons against a nuclear weapon state is suicidal, and against a non-nuclear weapon state, genocidal and patently unacceptably immoral. They have no possible use against terrorists. During the Cold War, nuclear deterrence theory reached its apex as a framework paradoxically designed to ensure non-use. However, the paradox of nuclear deterrence is that for it to work, the threat of use must be perceived as real. Dancing on the edge of catastrophe must become accepted as a daily reality. For this dangerous dance to be sustained, one must find a partner that knows and can be relied upon to follow its steps. To fail is fatal. The USSR and the US did not dance cheek to cheek. And yet we should remember that only good luck or God's grace has allowed us to be alive here today, all too closely having avoided the danse macabre. Deterrence is simply too dangerous. Even under the best circumstances, mistakes can and will be made. General Lee Butler was U.S. Commander of Strategic Nuclear Forces with the day-to-day responsibility for operations, discipline, training of tens of thousands of crew members, the systems they operated, and the warheads those systems were designed to deliver. He said that after he studied deeply into the history of the incidents and accidents of the nuclear age, as they had been recorded by the U.S. and USSR, quote, "It is more chilling than anything you can imagine." And he recounted, and I quote, "Missiles that blew up in their silos and ejected their nuclear warheads outside the confines of the silo. B-52 aircraft that collided with tankers and scattered nuclear weapons across the coast and into the offshore seas of Spain. A B-52 bomber with nuclear weapons aboard that crashed in North Carolina, and on investigation it was discovered that on one of those weapons, 6 of the 7 safety devices that prevent a nuclear explosion had failed as a result of the crash. There are dozens of such incidents. Nuclear missile-laden submarines that experienced catastrophic accidents and now lie at the bottom of the ocean." End of quote. The Cuban Missile Crisis gave the world 13 days to reach safety. How much time is enough to rectify human or mechanical error? The margin of error with close neighbors is negligible, and any error entirely unforgiving. What would happen if a playful computer hacker crossed a line where good humor became Armageddon? Would the motive matter? India has a deep existential interest in eliminating nuclear weapons rapidly. Moreover, amongst the nuclear weapon states, it alone has consistently and correctly set forth coherent arguments for abolition. India has highlighted that nuclear apartheid is practically and morally unacceptable and unsustainable. Gaining the status of the privilege does not change the correctness of the analysis, but it helps provide India with the credibility to lead in a movement for a nuclear weapons-free world. Sometimes it takes another piece of wood to take out a splinter. Will India be alone in this effort? When the likes of George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, William Perry, and Sam Nunn pen op-eds in the Wall Street Journal emphasizing that nuclear deterrence is inadequate to obtain security and efforts at non-proliferation cannot succeed without a clear commitment and path to obtain nuclear weapons abolition, none can any longer assert that abolition is either impractical or anti-American. It took 60 years for such realists to reach this conclusion. We thought that the U.S. nuclear superiority would bring security, but the arms race with the Soviet Union proved us wrong. The nuclear weapon states thought they could preach abstinence to South Asia while sitting on bar stools. India and Pakistan proved them wrong. If we all persist in the illusion that incoherence will bring stability, We do not know who will prove us all wrong next. And certainly, Iraq has demonstrated that the approach to contain nuclear threats through counter-proliferation is hardly an answer. I'm pleased to share that I'm part of a working group that arose under the leadership of President Gorbachev and George Shultz at a conference at Harvard University's Belfer Center to craft recommendations for the next presidents of Russia and the United States to move toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. It should be clear that many more oarsmen will be coming on board to join such good efforts in the near future. The choice is between attempting to maintain the status quo of a two-tiered security system which will result in ongoing creeping proliferation, clearly a route to hellfire, or global, legally verifiable, and enforceable elimination. This would be the fulfillment of India's moral vision for a better world and a gift to humanity in the name of all that is good as well as that of a good and great man, Rajiv Gandhi. A nuclear-free world is a world where the principle of equity is honored. Equity breeds stability, and inequity, instability. But there is a deeper reason, a universal reason, aptly described in the ancient epic, the Ramayana. In his dissenting opinion in the International Court of Justice's famous advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, Judge Christopher Weeramantree summarized this wondrous story in relevant part. During the war between Rama and Ravana, rulers respectively of India and Sri Lanka, I quote, "A weapon of war became available to Rama's half-brother, Lakshmana, which could destroy the entire race of the enemy, including those who could not bear arms. Rama advised Lakshmana that the weapon could not be used in war because such devastation en masse was forbidden by the ancient laws of war, even though Ravana was fighting an unjust war with an unrighteous motive. Such prohibitions were ancient several thousand years ago. This was truth then, and it remains true now. Why should we find the use of the plague so abhorrent as a weapon and accept the threatening devastation of nuclear devices? It is the indiscriminate and devastating effects of weapons of mass destruction which presents an unacceptable threat. India cannot eliminate unacceptable threats to its security by force. Pakistan will never disarm without India's disarming, and India will certainly not disarm without a similar gesture from China. Will China do so without Russia, and Russia without the United States? Thus we come back to the original logic of India. Let us follow a clear, direct route to nuclear disarmament that is non-discriminatory, comprehensive, legally verifiable, and universal. How can this be done now? It is time for stepping up the process. I thus suggest that India convene at the earliest possible time a nuclear weapons convention preparatory conference to examine the conditions to obtain a nuclear weapons convention and forge a path to its achievement. India is uniquely positioned to advance this route. It has the political arguments, the national interest, the cultural and moral calling, and the historic moment. The world needs the compass point of leadership. Where can this be found? Is it presumptuous for an American to call upon India to seize such a flag for us all? If nuclear weapons teach us anything good, it is a truth known for millennium by the wise everywhere. Humanity is one family. A catastrophe for any nation with these devices is a catastrophe for all. And of course, the leadership of one will be of service and great benefit to all. The ancient culture and wisdom of India identifies it as that leader for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to take up your challenge. Mr. Minister, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I want to acknowledge at the outset the remarkable speech we heard this morning from Prime Minister Singh. And I'm going to say a word about that at the end of my remarks. But as far as I'm concerned, this conference, in which we've been brought together by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the great work of Jasmine Singh, and the India Council of World Affairs, here led by Ashok Kumar, this conference has already been a success because it has brought to us the highest political authority in India with a message of strength and courage. And I want to speak about that today. Now, I was asked to come and talk about the United States and Russia as two of the big two in this subject, because they, of course, possess 95% of the 25,000 nuclear weapons in existence, and they have the chief responsibility in leading the way to nuclear disarmament. And so I must do this. But we should remember that far from fulfilling their responsibilities, they are standing in the way of genuine progress. We have to recognize this. In fact, it will be my thesis here today that both the United States and Russia must be led and energized by a series of like-minded states and civil society itself, in order that those two countries will recognize their moral and legal responsibilities, and moreover that it is in their interests to move to a world free of nuclear weapons. In short, the nuclear leaders themselves must be led. This paradox will require creativity, ingenuity, and not least, determination in order to resolve the nuclear weapons dilemma. I believe this task can be achieved, particularly if India plays a leading role. Now, both the U.S. and Russia would have us believe that they are in full compliance with their obligations under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They claim to have made what they call unprecedented progress since the end of the Cold War in the nuclear disarmament field. Well, certainly eliminating some 40,000 nuclear weapons from the Cold War peak of 65,000 is no small feat. And were they to continue to eliminate nuclear weapons at this rate, we could cheer. But the reductions so far have been a smokescreen for their stated intentions to maintain nuclear weapons far into the 21st century. While taking credit for chucking superfluous nuclear weapons, both countries continue modernization programs that will enable them to inflict immense and catastrophic destruction with fewer nuclear weapons.
The Nuclear Posture Review, conducted by the Bush administration in 2001, established an expansive plan to revitalize U.S. nuclear forces and all the elements that support them within a new triad of capacities combining nuclear and conventional offensive strikes with missile defenses and nuclear weapons infrastructure. Under the subsequent post-9/11 national security strategy, the administration said it would take what it called anticipatory action, so it's really a euphemism for preemptive strikes, against the enemies of the United States. And they have not ruled out using nuclear weapons, which remain a cornerstone of U.S. national policy. Now, although Congress has blocked funding for the Reliable Replacement Warhead program, it left intact funding for other programs that functionally include ongoing nuclear weapons research and development and provide the training for new nuclear scientists and engineers. In fact, Congress has authorized the administration, and I quote them directly, to develop and submit to the Congress a comprehensive nuclear weapons strategy for the 21st century. This action is in keeping with the call by the current commander of the United States Strategic Command, General Kevin Chilton, for the United States to maintain nuclear weapons for the remainder of the 21st century. Both the administration and Congress continue to anticipate the need to revitalize the present nuclear weapons complex. Well, I think that this approach renders meaningless the disarmament objective implicit in the current reductions of the numbers of weapons. The U.S. determination to maintain nuclear weapons into the 21st century has led former Russian President Vladimir Putin to announce in 2004 that Russia is carrying out research and missile tests of state-of-the-art nuclear missile systems. Russia, President Putin said, would continue to build up firmly and insistently our armed forces, including the nuclear component. The Russians, far from lowering the political value of nuclear weapons, have elevated them in their posture because of their conventional arms weakness. Nuclear dismantlements are offset by the continued deployment of newer, more capable road-mobile topple-end missiles, and a new Bory class of nuclear ballistic missile submarines is underway. Now then, the dangers posed by the continuing nuclear deployments are exacerbated by the U.S. and Russia's maintenance of 2,654 warheads on high alert status. This puts inhuman pressure on the leadership of both countries, who would have only a few minutes to decide whether notification of an incoming attack was accurate or a computer malfunction. The high alert status is both absurd and highly irresponsible. Yet both governments opposed a resolution in the United Nations in 2007 to reduce the operational status of nuclear weapons systems. Why are both states locked in a Cold War posture? A quarter of a century ago, the then UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar criticized the arrogance of the two nuclear superpowers. He said, and I quote him, "By what right do they decide the fate of all humanity? That question is still valid. Both countries continue to ignore the ruling of the International Court of Justice that negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons must be concluded. Such negotiations have not even begun. Nor is it likely that the other three declared nuclear weapon states, the United Kingdom, France, and China, will promote or participate in comprehensive negotiations until the United States and Russia drastically reduce their overwhelming numbers. And there isn't the slightest sign of this happening. Worse, the U.S. insists on deploying a missile defense system, ostensibly to counter an emerging Iranian capability. They want to deploy this in interceptors in Poland and a radar installation in the Czech Republic. Russia has objected strenuously to this plan. Whatever the long-range implications of a reignited nuclear arms race, we can certainly see it at this very moment that the cooperation necessary to establish confidence in negotiating further has been reduced. For its part, NATO, which still clings to a nuclear weapons doctrine, nuclear weapons are essential, the doctrine says, appears to be little interested in helping the international community to find security without nuclear weapons. Instead of influencing the U.S., their major partner, the non-nuclear states of NATO sublimate their own aspirations for a nuclear weapons-free world to U.S. dominance. Many of them admit privately that the proliferation of nuclear weapons cannot be stopped as long as major states retain their nuclear arsenals, but they say nothing. And they're still resisting civil society efforts to get the U.S. tactical nuclear weapons out of the 5 NATO countries in Europe. Well, now, at the level of existing politics that I have so far been talking about, the outlook is not good. But there are glimmers of hope on the horizon. And it is those glimmers of hope that I now want to direct our attention. Much has been made of the Kissinger, Schultz, Nunn, Perry op-ed articles framing nuclear disarmament steps within the goal of abolition. Given its proponents, the Hoover Initiative puts to rest the assertion that being for the abolition of nuclear weapons is unrealistic. In other words, we now have a strong case being made at high levels in the United States that abolition of nuclear weapons is not a pipe dream, but a necessity. Moreover, since the presumptive Republican and Democratic nominees for president, John McCain and Barack Obama, have articulated progressive policies on nuclear disarmament, everyone is waiting for the next U.S. administration to signal at least a willingness to work cooperatively in the multilateral system. It appears possible that an amenable U.S. administration, starting in 2009, will work for a successful review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2010. And by that I mean at least not a failed conference. But because the standard for non-failure has already been set so low, it is not likely that any significant advance to a nuclear weapon-free world will be made at the review conference itself, important as that conference is. However, 2 events The inauguration of a U.S. administration willing to respect international law and a review conference that keeps the Non-Proliferation Treaty alive, if still weak, will set the stage for some serious nuclear disarmament work to begin. What should that work be, and who should participate? A traditional or orthodox approach would be to call for the United States and Russia to negotiate a new strategic reduction treaty, applying the principles of verification, transparency, and irreversibility to both delivery systems and warheads. That would certainly be an important step. So would the entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and successful negotiations to produce a verified fissile material cutoff treaty. Maybe that's all we can get. Given the track record of both states, accomplishing this would be regarded by many as a great feat. But it will not produce the nuclear weapons-free world that is not only the subject of this conference, but the ardent desire of countless people around the world. Experience has shown that a step-by-step basis does not produce nuclear disarmament. Rather, a holistic or comprehensive approach is necessary. The steps must be fitted into the vision and intention to achieve a nuclear weapons-free world. And as I've said, the United States and Russia do not have this vision. Left alone, both countries, U.S. and Russia, will do the minimum to make it appear that they are engaged in nuclear disarmament, while at the same time retaining their modernized nuclear arsenals. The world will still be divided between nuclear haves and have-nots. The unstable two-class world will go on. So I'd like to go just a bit farther now and think about the second decade of the 21st century about to start in a couple of years. The second decade of this century. I believe a confluence of forces may allow us to make renewed efforts to establish a framework or a convention prohibiting and eliminating all nuclear weapons. Already, a model nuclear weapons convention exists as a UN document. Such an instrument can unify the non-nuclear weapon states if they take it seriously. Like-minded governments and the advanced wing of civil society have much to do to proclaim the model convention and advance its credibility. The major role of those who believe in the necessity of a nuclear weapons-free world, and that number is growing, is to convince the United States and Russia that the only way to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons is to ban them entirely. The U.S. and Russia do not believe this at the present time. But neither country is impervious to the considered views of its friends and allies. So the first thing to do is to have the U.S. and Russia exercise the responsibility to lead the way to nuclear disarmament. The first thing to do to get that, other potential nuclear weapon states from acquiring the ultimate weapon. This intimidation must be resisted. coalitions of governments, the New Agenda Coalition is a good example, must raise their voices and connect with a strong anti-nuclear weapon public opinion that already exists within the United States and Russia. Polls have shown this. Civil society movements, the Middle Powers Initiative that I represent here today is but one example. They must work increasingly closely with like-minded governments to mount a world campaign. That campaign must culminate in a global summit for the elimination of nuclear weapons, the kind of summit called for by Kofi Annan and the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission, the very summit that Johnson Granoff alluded to when he talked about a preparatory meeting for one. The power of a sustained world movement will have a deep effect on the policies of the United States and Russia. And now I turn for just a moment to India. India should be a proponent, if not an instigator, of this new world movement toward the abolition of nuclear weapons. I have been to India many times, and I know of the long-standing Indian desire for a nuclear weapons-free world. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was the first leader to sign on to the Six Nation Initiative in 1983. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi brought his action plan for a nuclear weapons-free world to the United Nations in 1988, and the premise of that action plan is as valid today as it was 20 years ago. That premise is non-nuclear weapon states would not acquire nuclear weapons in return for a global process to eliminate all nuclear weapons. The Western states dismissed Gandhi's plan. And, truth to tell, the changing governments of India lost heart that a country could be powerful and non-nuclear at the same time, and they turned India into a nuclear weapons state. Nonetheless, the vision of a nuclear weapons-free world is not dead in India. Far from it. India votes regularly at the United Nations for active plans to reduce nuclear dangers and for a convention to prohibit not only the use of nuclear weapons under any circumstances, but also the development and stockpiling of nuclear weapons. And only 3 months ago in this country, your president, the President of India, stated, and I quote directly, India remains committed to universal, non-discriminatory, and comprehensive nuclear disarmament, as reflected in the action plan by the late Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, and has called for the renewed effort for general and complete disarmament, particularly nuclear disarmament. This very conference, entitled Towards a World Free of Nuclear Weapons, will end tomorrow with a recapitulation of Rajiv Gandhi's vision for a nuclear weapons-free world. Clearly, there is a renewed desire in India to once more strike a stance to rid the world of nuclear Armageddon. I don't think it's too much to say that India today is at a crossroads and holds the global future of nuclear weapons in its hands. By a powerful outreach to other nations in every part of the world, India, it can be a catalyst to influence the U.S. and Russia to come down from the nuclear mountain. India must become active in new efforts for global nuclear disarmament. The world will welcome India actively working with like-minded states for the advancement of human civilization by the abolition of nuclear weapons. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask your indulgence to give me 2 more minutes to speak frankly and personally to this audience. I told you at the outset that I was moved greatly by the courageous speech of Prime Minister Singh this morning. 3 months ago, when I was here in India, my last trip, I had the pleasure of participating in a meeting with Prime Minister Singh, at which time a discussion took place. I'm not going to say who said what, but it was evident that the discussion about the 20th anniversary of the Rajiv Gandhi principles is upcoming. And I took away from that meeting with the Prime Minister a pretty good signal that he would like something to happen. Whether he can do this himself or have India do it himself, I'm not competent to say. But his presence here and the forthcoming presence of other distinguished leaders of the government of India tells me, an outsider, that there's something happening here and that we have a new potential. Like some of my colleagues, I came a long way to this conference. Matter of fact, it took me 24 hours, door to door. And I wouldn't do that lightly. But I came because I suspect in my head and I feel in my heart that the leadership of India, maybe not them all, but a key leadership in India recognizes that just because India went nuclear in 1998 doesn't invalidate or doesn't mean that you've lost your voice and your ability to participate and lead in a new global campaign. Moreover, all the realists among us recognize that it is in India's interests to move to the world being nuclear free. And thus to the skeptics and to the doubters and all those who say you've got to have a nuclear weapon if you're going to be an important country. We have new mounting evidence coming at us now from around the world, but such is not the case. And indeed, the perpetuation of nuclear weapons through the 21st century virtually guarantees a catastrophe of unspeakable proportions coming. I was a young man when I first came to this country, 1963. I've been coming regularly since then. And I was with Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in 1983 when I personally asked her if she would lead the way in the Six Nation Initiative, which was then to speak to Washington and Moscow to start negotiating and come down from this nuclear mountain. To her credit, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi said yes immediately, and she followed through. Then she picked up the telephone, and she called her son Rajiv. She said, Rajiv, I've got Mr. Roche here in my office, and he's telling me about what India can do to play a role in moving the world to a safer position with respect to nuclear weapons. She said, I want you to meet him. So I was sitting there very innocently. Next thing I knew, I was being driven over to Rajiv Gandhi's house, where I was honored to be received by him. We spoke for an hour in his study. And Rajiv Gandhi told me his aspirations for a nuclear weapons-free world, what he wanted. And of course, he followed that through with his great statement in 1988 at the United Nations, where I was present and heard it. Shortly after, the Rajiv Gandhi Memorial Foundation was started, and I came back to India again to be one of the first signers of that statement in the Rajiv Gandhi Memorial document that says the total or the abolition, complete elimination of nuclear weapons is a precondition to the safety of civilization in the 21st century. Well, the 90s went on. And I came again. And I pleaded with Prime Minister Gujarat not to test the nuclear weapon. The government changed. Decisions were made. Here we are. Some would say we've now had a lost decade, not from India, but as a result of the leadership of the West. And in my speech a moment ago, I talked about a new moment, a sort of a curve in the tortuous run of history coming in 2009 and 2010. Something can happen through a coalition, a new dynamic that is awakening in the world. And I have come this long distance to India from Canada to say to this distinguished gathering today, India, do not stand outside the new discussion. Participate vigorously. Let there be at least a working party come out of this conference that will take the Rajiv Gandhi ideas and say, how can they be applied? How can we reach into the tentacles of Washington and Moscow with these ideas? How can we work with those wide range of countries that want to move forward? How can we connect with that burgeoning civil society groups? There are new dynamics. India, be part of it. Thank you for allowing me to spend these moments with you.